the University of British Columbia. He has an interest in alcohol use disorder and liver disease in the Indo-Canadian population and the use of oat for treatments of OUD in immigrant youth. He plans to work and continue doing addictions research in Fraser Health. He hopes to develop skills in treating both the addictions and medicine aspects of alcohol use disorder in this underserved population. So please give him a warm welcome, and I'll hand it over to Misha.
Thank you, Ramin. And as you can see, e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury meets none of my usual interests, but that's not good. But we'll chat about it today anyway. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm respectfully working on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I wish I had more disclosures than this, but really the main thing to know is that I'm not a respirologist or an expert in nicotine addiction. In fact, when it comes to the later parts of the talk, I'm not a radiologist or a pathologist either, so feel free to jump in. I'd already picked this topic a little while ago for my What's New in Addiction Medicine talk, but it was really interesting that sort of brought it home for me. This was published in the New York Times about a week and a half ago, where they reported that a 15-year-old had passed away from vaping-associated lung injury. And they published none of the details around this case. They did mention that this person, we don't know male or female, even had some kind of underlying lung pathology prior to this. But the photo they published along with that was one taken back in November when in Detroit, the first double lung transplant was done for this condition in an 18-year-old. So we're talking about folks that are supposed to be young, healthy, out there living their lives, running into a lot of trouble with this. So I think it's an important and interesting topic right now. Really interesting quote from the person who actually did that transplant operation. What he had to say was, "What I saw in his lungs is like nothing I've seen before. I've been doing lung transplants for 20 years. This is an evil I haven't faced before." So why don't we talk about E-Valley in a bit. But first, we'll discuss nicotine addiction, its history, its epidemiology, its current burdens. We'll talk about some of the history of e-cigarettes and vaping itself, the epidemiology around it. Then we'll talk about the lung injury, the epidemiology of that, and our understanding of the current causes of that. And eventually we'll conclude with a whole lot of stuff that we still don't know. So when it comes to the tobacco plant, it was discovered by the native people of Mesoamerica and South America. It's for thousands of years, it's been used in rituals and ceremonies and prayers, as well as recreationally. It was introduced to the rest of the world through European colonization in the 1500s, and this thing spread like wildfire. Essentially, by the 1540s, it had made its way around the world. It was already in Japan and many other places. And the Columbian transformation, where 4 crops, so maize, potatoes, tobacco, that were transferred to the rest of the world. Tobacco is the only one that's pretty much grown in every known country. It really took off on a more public health level basis when in the 1880s, it was commercialized through cigarette rolling machines. And we started seeing reports in terms of health impacts coming out in the early 1900s. Of course, the 2 major studies that are usually landmarked are the British doctor study in 1951 that clearly related tobacco to multiple issues, including early death, and the US Surgeon General's warning in 1961 that smoking tobacco causes cancer. So from a public health perspective, we look at smoking rates in Canada. This graph only goes up to the 2017 year, but further data is available. currently, our efforts, while they've been quite successful, where 50% of people used to smoke back in 1965, it's down to that 14 to 17% range. We've pretty much flattened out the curve now. And the most recent data says it's 15.8% as of 2018 of daily and occasional smokers, the majority of them being daily, just above 10%. 8.6% of students in grades 7 to 9 and a significant chunk of youth, 8%, are current smokers or have smoked in the past. And a huge percentage of us are exposed to secondhand smoke. And we actually know that in Canada, even today, secondhand smoke is leading to a significant number of deaths, around 1,000 people a year. And BC, luckily for us, has amongst the lowest national smoking rates, though this really varies on depending how the data is measured. Saskatchewan is the highest at 20%. Tons of not so helpful things in cigarettes outside of the nicotine, the one that we're actually addicted to, and the one that serves as an insecticide. But lots of other bad stuff. The tar we all talk about, material for paving roads, and as my anatomy professor used to point out in medical school, also good for paving aortas. Acetone, cadmium, known to cause massive lung problems, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, all kinds of bad juju. And it leads to a lot of terrible things, as we've been taught for a long time. Since it's something that affects the vasculature, it's a systemic issue. We talk about the strokes, the heart disease, the issues with diabetes and chronic kidney disease. One of the ones that I find actually helpful in talking to my younger patients, especially of the male persuasion, is to talk about how it causes early ED, but affects every part of the body. If we look at the costs and substance use in Canada across all the major things that affect us, in fact, it's tobacco that actually has the highest rate of healthcare costs. That's the maroon colored bar there. And it's overall in societal costs, it's only second to alcohol in terms of costing around $12 billion a year to our society. And these are estimates from 2014. And what's interesting is that, as people live longer due to other causes, these numbers have actually gone up, not down, regardless of the fact that we've actually brought smoking rates down quite a bit. So in terms of the costs of death, around 45,000 lives a year, 1 in 5 deaths in Canada are at least partly attributable to smoking. And this again is up significantly from 37,000. This is despite the fact that, again, there's much more screening now available, relatively speaking, to past years. Way fewer people are smoking, yet we're still struggling from that perspective. So if we look at people wanting to quit in terms of Canadian studies, this is data from the Tobacco Use in Canada survey from 2017. The vast majority of folks will cite health as their #1 reason to quit. And interestingly, 63.1% of all smokers ever have quit by now. And the majority of the folks that are now diagnosed with lung cancers are actually ex-smokers and not current smokers. 46% have tried quitting in the last year, and a lot of folks still plan to quit in the next 6 months to 27%. So given all these burdens with tobacco, with nicotine addiction, I think it's a very worthwhile effort to consider any technology that might come in that might offer to take away a huge chunk of that, negative tar, cadmium, and all those other things. They should highly be considered. So jumping into one of those possibilities that's become quite popular, e-cigarettes. So e-cigarettes are essentially battery-powered vaporizers that create an aerosol that is inhaled. Vaping is more of a misnomer because you're not truly creating a vape, but it's such a popular term that's caught on since the 70s that, you know, it's hard to change that at this point. It tends to simulate many of the behavioral aspects of smoking, the hand-to-mouth motion, the smoke, the aerosol. And common ingredients in there include e-liquids. In the e-liquids that are aerosolized are nicotine, THC, and many of them come without either one of these, as well as propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, which are common food components, and various flavorings. These are the intentional ones anyway. These were originally designed and marketed as cessation tools, and they are a nice little business of $14 billion estimated last year. The Canadian estimates vary anywhere from 300 million to close to $1 billion. We don't have great data on this overall. They do go by a lot of other names. Some of them are worth keeping in mind, so e-cigs that I'll be using a lot just to keep my sentences shorter. The ones that come up in literature a lot are electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS, or non-medicinal nicotine delivery systems. There's some pretty cool names too, I thought, like Cigalikes, that's kind of cool. E-shisha, personal favorite, Techno Froggers. Yeah. And I don't know if Dr. McLean's out here, but he's a lover of all things chasing of the dragons, so cloud chasing vaporizers, also kind of neat. Okay, if we look at the history of e-cigarettes, the first patent was actually filed all the way back in 1930, and if you look at the patent archives, you can actually find that. The one that I'm showing you here is one published from '65, and the reason I picked this image is because it was essentially, it shows a structure that's much closer to what we actually use even today. This was actually a big thing that Phil Ray, who was one of the co-inventors of the microprocessor and like one of the biggest people in the early age of the Silicon Valley, he really wanted to get this technology to work, and he started producing things in 1979 through the 80s. The main thing that's left as part of that legacy that we still use today is the word vape. That's where the term vaping actually comes from. In reality, the commercial e-cigarette that we know today was essentially born in 2003 in Beijing by Han Lick. This was a 52-year-old pharmacist. He was an inventor and a current smoker at the time. It's believed that he created this device after his father died, who was also a heavy smoker, and he died from lung cancer. And essentially, mostly it's thought that all of these tries that were made in the 80s and the 90s led to Hong Lick finally being successful. And his e-cigarette is still available under the name Ruyan, which stands for like smoke. That's pretty cool. And his initial patent was granted by the US office in 2007. These products started arriving in Europe and North America in 06, 07. But it's really in the 2010s that they've really taken off. So if you look at what an e-cigarette tends to look like, a couple cool features. You can have a light at the front. You know it's truly arrived as a technology product because someone's tried to put a Bluetooth speaker in there. You know, sometimes you need the music right in your face. The battery is a super important component. A lot of devices will have switches to turn them on and off. There's the mouthpiece in the back. The atomizer sits next to the cartridge or the heating fluid, the fluid that you heat up, and it comes out through the mouthpiece to you. A few other things have been tried, like ultrasound technology and all this stuff, which haven't really caught on all that much. But a few things have changed. You know, the initial ones were largely disposable. They were very low capacity, would deliver very little nicotine into the lungs. And as the years went on, we got higher size batteries, much bigger tanks. You could switch off the atomizers and the mouthpieces. You started getting puff counters as well as buttons to change up the voltage, which would increase the amount of e-liquid that would be burnt off. And you started getting many different formulations. So there's over 10,000 different types of e-liquids and cartridges available. So this is one of the first ones. This is one of the ones that Han produced with his company. Does anyone recognize what this is? Brendan?
Juul.
Nice. Juul. Men's Fitness magazine called it the iPhone of e-cigarettes, and I tend to agree. It looks cool, it works easy. One of the main things that they brought in, and they weren't the absolute first ones to do it, but they were the first ones to truly commercialize this on a big base, is that nicotine salts, they switched from free-base nicotine to nicotine salts, and this produces a vapor that is way less harsher than the other stuff. They also significantly increase the concentration of nicotine. So the maximum concentration allowed in Canada is 66, same in the States. They are one of the highest level producers. They also make these little cool cartridges called Juul pods. My understanding is the mango flavor is the most popular, though I do not have personal experience, unfortunately. These tend to recharge with a pretty cool magnetic looking USB dock, kind of like the ones that used to be in the MacBooks. They can fall right off if they're pulled on. And they have massive market share. There's another company called Wipe, which is also owned by one of the major tobacco companies, Imperial Smoke, that also has a significant market share, but Juul's by far the #1. And interestingly enough, when Juul started becoming popular, so 2 years ago, Altris, which is the new version of Philip Morris, made a 35% purchase in Juul for a 12.8 billion stake. Although what happened last summer has led them to lose a little bit of money, I believe. So if we look at how nicotine delivery from e-cartridges has changed over time, this is more with newer third-gen nicotine delivery devices, and we're essentially looking at how much nicotine is found in blood concentrations. The two main things that play a key role are, one, as you can see, the triangle, which is the highest concentration nicotine amount, delivers the most amount of nicotine. And the other thing being, if you're experienced in using e-cigs. So if you're naive to using an e-cigarette, you're not going to be able to pull out nearly as much as when you're an experienced person. But these numbers, especially at these higher concentrations, are very much actually comparable to how much nicotine you're getting from regular cigarettes or low nicotine cigarettes. Ultimately, the Juul is actually, because you're able to take so many puffs, is actually able to give you more nicotine on a per puff and per unit of time basis. So just looking at the usual toxins that we would check any product for in e-cigarettes, the data tends to be a bit all over the place. There's only a few studies. The main thing folks have looked at is in terms of metals, and especially heavy metals. And a big study by Williams et al. In PLOS 1, published in 2017, showed that when they looked at 8 different e-cigarettes, Juul not included, but Wipe was, they found that significant concentrations of heavy metals were there, even as compared to conventional smoke. But Halstead et al., and these guys are really experienced in terms of looking at how much toxicity there is in regular cigarettes. They published in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology in 2019, showing this new trapping method for the smoke, that the levels were actually, for the metals, were generally actually significantly lower. We don't really know where the situation overall stands, but we can be fairly confident that the toxic metals in e-cigarettes do increase as you increase the power setting, you know, the power settings that we were talking about earlier on the e-cigarette itself, and they tend to be higher in the open design, so meaning where you can sort of you fill in the cartridge and like the e-liquid into the e-cigarette itself rather than having the cartridge separately. So e-cigarettes in Canada have been essentially available semi-legally since 2007. They started gaining quite a bit of popularity again in the 2010s, but they were formally legalized by the Tobacco and Vaping Product Act in 2018. This also regulates the sale to adults only. It requires that the labeling not be particularly attractive to youth and the marketing not be as such, though that's very challenging to control in this social media day and age, and bans the use of certain ingredients. There's also further acts that apply to vaping, but this quote here, which came with the Health Canada announcement, vaping is less harmful than smoking. While searching for this talk, I cannot tell you how many websites which were pro-vaping products or selling vaping products were just full of this quote coming in different ways. And I'll show you a couple examples there later. If we look at the strongest e-cigarette use data we have, this is a bit old in Canada. What we find is that about 15% of Canadian adults have tried e-cigarettes. Again, this number is probably nearly double that. If you look at the latest high quality American data, that's what it shows. But either way, increase is significantly increasing over time. I think the other thing that really sticks out from these data is the fact that these younger age groups all tend to have the highest levels as compared to the 45 plus age group there. And when you look at the Canada Student Tobacco and Alcohol Survey from 2017, in fact, from the same year, more young folks had tried e-cigarettes than adults total, if you can compare that number even somewhat, at 23 to 15%. And it was a much lower number for the traditional cigarette. And the majority of kids are telling us that it's really easy for them to get to these things. If we look at the latest Canadian and American data in terms of use, so this is from Hammond et al., based in Waterloo. They're telling us about 29% of Canadians, of young people aged 16 to 19 have vaped ever, which is a big jump from the numbers we used to have previously from smoking ever. And this is only increasing from 29% in 2017 to 37% in 2018. And the latest data from the States, again, the number in the last 30 days used for e-cigarettes has gone from 11.7% in 2017 to 27.5% in a large swath of high school students. This is data based in North Carolina, so it's probably going to tend to be a little bit higher than the Canadian population overall. So we talked about all those laws that are putting in place ways of stopping the kids from smoking this stuff, but you know, you see much more of this online, really. I mean, this would get me, I think. Vaping causes teens to feel cool. You know, like they're putting in birthday cake flavoring. They're sponsoring these Instagram influencers, which every second young person I know wants to be. For example, this young lady here, she has 42,000 followers, and she actually regrets this partnership with Stealth that she did. But, you know, when I try to put up pics of my kid on the Instagram, they're always running into folks vaping there for sure. And I can only imagine what the pressures are like on the younger people. There's also like random pop-up lounges. There's one that actually got banned in Dundas Square in Toronto. Sorry, it's Dundas, I think. And like, you know, you basically have these attractive folks just giving out vape samples, and they got shut down because they were not differentiating by age or any such thing. And this is happening all over. This is not, she regrets her steps, and she was featured in the Globe and Mail story, so it was easy for me to steal this picture, but there's literally thousands and thousands of others. And when we look at the monitoring and the enforcement that Health Canada and the Government of Canada are doing, you know, They say they've seized around 60,000 products that are non-compliant from vape shots, and that was just between July and October. And this was a number that they were bumping up in, like, in light of this, the whole vaping-associated lung injury going on. And they'd hit about 1,000 locations. The fact of the matter is over 13,000 outlets, which are largely unregulated, sell vapes in Canada, and we don't have real control over this. And they carry tens of thousands of products, a lot of which they don't keep at the front, a lot of which they'll tend to sell under the table. So we've talked about how e-cigarettes are taken off, but how about them as a tool in smoking cessation? There could be something good going on, right? Initial data, so this is the studies from, say, 2010 on to 2016 that were last looked at by the Cochrane collaboration in terms of systematic review. The evidence showed that essentially there's only 2 high-quality trials, and they showed that nicotine-containing e-cigs overall have a modest effect on long-term cessation. No head-to-head trials against nicotine replacement therapy were available at the time, and there was, some studies also showed that there was essentially no benefit. Other cohort data from the UK by Hajic et al. Did show that varenicline can be helpful in abstinence from both vaping and from vaping and cigarette smoking users. So this group's pretty big, they're pretty active. Same gentleman here, Peter Hajic, published probably one of the bigger known trials in this field in the New England Journal last year. And they showed that randomized multi-center trial of 886 patients who received counseling and either combination NRT, that's the good one, where they get multiple options, or e-cigarettes. There was almost a doubling of abstinence rates at the 1-year mark, 18% compared to 9.9%. And even earlier abstinence times, there was generally significantly higher than the nicotine replacement group. There's no head-to-head trial of against varenicline. Not sure who would be willing to pay for that, whether it be the e-cigarette industry or the pharma company that produces that, but either way. So far, what we've discussed for e-cigarettes and vaping is, like, we've seen the history of commercialization, we've seen the usage patterns that are particularly dominant amongst the youth, and we've talked about how it can deliver a large amount of nicotine, but also some toxins that we can detect. And I think you can reasonably say it has a role as a smoking cessation tool. And then things changed last summer quite a bit. Before we start talking about E-Valley, which is e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury, though you'll see this go by a number of other names. One of the more prominent ones in the literature is probably vaping associated pulmonary illness, but Valley, e-cigarette, respiratory illness, all kinds of things, is to realize that all of this data essentially starts last July. It's new, it's very much evolving, so please take it all with a grain of salt, but most of it was published in good journals, and it sounds fancy, so I'll present it now. So E-Valley is essentially an acute respiratory illness. It tends to have a gradual onset over days, not so much weeks, but it can actually progress quite a bit over hours as well once symptoms start to get particularly bad. It's often accompanied by constitutional and gastrointestinal symptoms. And the majority of the symptoms that people have are non-specific. So shortness of breath, sore throat, cough, fever, weight loss, nausea, vomiting. It's fairly challenging to differentiate from influenza and community-acquired pneumonia, and those are essentially part of the rule out that you have to do before making this diagnosis of exclusion. And the concerning part is that a huge percent of the folks that have run into this injury are young people. 78% of them are below the age of 35, and a lot of them are requiring an ICU stay. 50% of the over 2,000 people that have been hospitalized with this have actually required to stay in the ICU. So there's no one pathological way of figuring out when someone has E-Valley. You essentially have to take more of a case-by-case basis, but one of the key components is e-cigarette or dabbing use within the last 90 days before symptoms onset. And then these might not be present early on, but the presence of pulmonary infiltrates and opacities on chest radiographs, and often ground glass opacities, which we'll talk about in some detail. You can be much more confident in this if their respiratory viral panel essentially comes out negative and they don't have clear pneumonia. And I think this is a reasonable thing to say, that no evidence of medical record of alternative plausible diagnosis. I think if someone clearly has a new diagnosis of bronchogenic carcinoma and they have a pneumonia and they're vaping, odds are still good that it's more likely a pneumonia superimposed on the carcinoma. The probable cases are where you again have the e-cigarette use present, the pulmonary infiltrates are there, but you have a co-infection that clinically to you does not fit with the person's presentation and understanding of their high level of underlying lung injury. For example, if you think they have this tiny pneumonia in the left lower there, but they've got these massive bilateral findings that we're about to talk about. If you look at the epidemiology of this was first reported to any health authority in Wisconsin on July 10th, and the first cases under the CDC were reported on August 1st. As of January 14th, which is the latest update from the CDC, they've been doing weekly updates up until December. Now they've gone bi-weekly. About 2,700 folks have been affected in all 50 states, 2 different territories. We have data from Canada that it's in multiple provinces. 60 confirmed deaths with E-Valley playing a very important role. It's male predominant, depending on the location and the data you look at. It's around 2/3 men, as often addiction-related things tend to be. 78% of the folks affected are quite young, below the age of 35. And it's interesting that THC has been, or THC vaping products specifically, have been named as the main issue and culprit there, but only 82% in total have specifically asked for those products or are using dual products. And if you look at any study, 10 to 20% are using nicotine or non-nicotine, non-THC products altogether. And even in fairly large studies, which are confirmed with patients. So there's an Illinois study from December where they looked at 121 patients and personally conducted interviews with each one, and around 15% of folks said, no, I was not using anything related to THC or vitamin C acetate, as we'll see. Looking at Canadian specific data, there's 16 confirmed cases, again, as of January 14th. Symptom onset has varied between May and December. And around 10 of these folks, again, had nothing to do with the THC-induced vapes whatsoever. And where we as medical professionals are highly encouraged to report any suspected cases to provincial and territorial health authorities. And overall, looking at the surveillance data, this is probably the most interesting study that's come out, again, published in the New England Journal on December 20th. 4 big studies came out then. What essentially they show is that when you look at counts per 1 million ED visits in relation to 2 things, e-cigarette use and shortness of breath, dyspnea, these spikes are different by different age groups, but essentially on a per million basis for ED visits for the young people, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, that's where you're seeing the peaks. It's the young folks that are otherwise would never come into hospital with shortness of breath or any such thing are now coming in, and this is becoming a huge part of their ER visits. And if you look at a word pair ratio between shortness of breath in patients of all ages, as well as e-cigarette use, this is again done with massive databases which involve millions of patients using ICD-10 codes. the insurance codes that they use in the States. It takes off in June that you start seeing, and the spike happens in September to October there. So moving on to what kind of radiologic features we'll generally see. If you see anything on the initial chest x-ray, it'll tend to be bibasilar predominant infiltrates, tending to often be in the dependent portions. What's interesting about these chest x-rays is these were taken 12 hours apart in the same patient who showed up in shortness of breath. You know, I'm not a radiologist, but I can tell a little bit of too much weight there. The CT scanning generally will show bilateral ground glass opacities. These tend to be subpleural sparing in general, right there. But there's no typical finding. The main thing to know about the imaging, at least for vaping-associated lung injury, is that it's pneumonitis, and all kinds of pneumonitis has been observed. Additional findings have also included pleural effusions, pneumomediastinum, as well as tree and bud opacities. This is specifically for what we think of as the vitamin E acetate associated lung injury, but the gamut varies quite a bit. So if you look at panel number 1, panel A here, we're looking at a 20-year-old man with diffuse alveolar damage, and there's dependent consolidation in the posterior region there, diffuse ground glass, and some areas of bronchial dilations indicated there and there, and just overall very diffuse alveolar damage. This image in panel B is a 19-year-old woman, acute eosinophilic pneumonia, again in the context of e-cigarette use, and lots of areas of diffuse, more nodular consolidation and ground glass opacities all over. And there's some septal thickening there as well. For panel C, we're looking at a 35-year-old man with pattern of clear hypersensitivity pneumonitis. And panel D, this was diagnosed on the basis of a surgical biopsy. This lady was actually more exposed to cobalt from her vape pen, which is one of the metals we talked about earlier a bit. And what you're seeing is fibrosis characterized by reticulation and ground glass opacities. Honestly, the main take-home message and my simple approach to CT scans, a normal CT scan of the chest is very difficult to call. It's either too much black or too much white. This, my friends, is too much white. When we move on to the pathology, the normal lung, beautiful, lots of nice looking alveoli, blood vessels, larger air vessel there, smooth muscle. We look at the pathology in vaping associated lung injury. This is published in the New England Journal as well in October, where they looked at the histopathological findings from 17 patients. Earlier, it had been reported that that it looks often like more of a lipoid pneumonia, and that's really didn't seem to be the case. There was actually a lot of commonalities. So panel A here is showing airway-centered, just diffuse acute lung injury. In B, we're looking at severe bronchiolitis, marked edema present all over, as well as sloughing of the epithelium. And my favorite word from E-Valley pathology anyway, you're seeing a lot of foamy and vacuolated macrophages with peribronchial airspace in the peribronchial airspace. And finally, this was one of the worst cases. This patient, unfortunately, passed away after. This was very severe injury with just diffuse alveolar damage. Just can't appreciate much normal lung mass there at all. So I've thrown this out there a bit. I'm sure folks have probably come across this term, vitamin E acetate. So the main study that tells us that this is likely the main culprit, and again, like association is not causation, but strong association there again published in the New England Journal on December 20th. This is when the CDC announced that this is likely to be the case as well, by the Lung Injury Response Laboratory Working Group. They found that in the bronchoalveolar lavage fluid collected from 51 patients from a number of different facilities and states, they used isotope dilution mass spec to measure several of the main toxins that they thought could be responsible. And the main thought was it would be vitamin E acetate or plant oils. And what they found was that this vitamin E acetate is present in 48 out of the 51 samples. The only two other detectable things were coconut oil in one of the samples that was independent, and I believe the limonen, which I have never heard of before, was present in one of the samples that also already had vitamin E acetate in it as well. So about 94% of patients in their lungs have vitamin E acetate present when they present with this injury. And they were being compared to 99 healthy volunteers who were already participating in a different study that have been ongoing. What's also interesting is that the pathology cases we discussed, this vitamin E acetate study, these lavages are not all just from 2019. They go as far back as 2018. This is not a phenomenon just from last summer. It's an ongoing thing. So we've talked about the pathology and the radiology and what the clinical findings might be. This is how the CDC recommends that we treat these folks. I think it's largely supportive. You want to get that full history. You want to get all those labs that we talked about done, especially looking at what their O2 sat is, how much respiratory distress they're in, whether they're positive for the flu or for strep pneumo, etc. And then you want to decide whether they're appropriate for inpatient or outpatient management. Essentially, there's no one set treatment. The vast majority of these patients got antibiotics because there's a new condition. When you see a young person coming in with difficulty to breathe and weird infiltrates, I think 99% of us, perhaps more, would start some kind of antibiotics. Corticosteroids can be considered. There's no specific evaluation. It's only if the situation seems to be considerably worsening. IV methylpred is generally has been the treatment of choice. Do suggest the annual flu vaccine, and please get them to stop vaping. Unfortunately, what's happened is that multiple patients have relapsed to vaping and had to return to hospital. Some of them even despite being told that this was going on. We don't have very exact numbers on this, but still concerning. So vitamin E acetate itself, it's a fine substance known as alpha tocopherol acetate. It's essentially a synthetic form of vitamin E that was made by one of the pharmaceutical / cosmetic companies. La Roche, I think, is a pharma. Back in '63. It's widely used in cosmetic products as well as a number of nutritional supplements, mostly because it's less acidic, lasts longer compared to vitamin E, which is a combination of like 4 different tocopherols. It's not considered harmful when ingested or used topically, but what we do know about vitamin E acetate in E Valley is that it was first identified September 5th. I think the news broke around this thing like late summer, so like mid-August. And by September 5th, the New York State Department had recognized the fact that 10 to 18 of the products that were being used by these E Valley patients contained vitamin E acetate. So they had suggested that as a possible culprit. And then finally, when this study came out on December 20th, the CDC announced that this is strongly linked to the E Valley outbreak. Basically, it's from a number of diverse sources, but it's not sufficient to rule out the contribution of other possible chemicals in THC or non-THC containing vaping products. So we need to be on top of that still. I think one of the take-home messages from this entire talk is that the lungs are not your gut or your skin. They are not designed to take in substances that do a fine otherwise. We actually know that vegetable glycerin and propylene glycol, those same things that are considered the main component and mainstay of virtually all of these liquids, actually are known pulmonary irritants. And it's funny, it's not just the companies doing it. Here at the rack, I had a patient who told me, oh, you know, I got the right formula, doc. I got the right combination of glycerin and glycol, you know, it makes the best vapes. I'm selling out. So he was making his own supply locally and putting who knows what else in it, and selling it on the go. And we just do not understand the long-term effects of these things. And that's, I think, a very important and key take-home message. In terms of conclusions and future directions, I think e-cigarettes definitely do present a very new public and clinical health challenge. I think we were very, very successful in some ways in cutting down how much smoking's been happening in the last 50 years, especially amongst the young. Like some of the American studies had youth usage down to like 7.9%, like down to 8% amongst all folks aged 15 to 20, and now it's with the e-cigarette use, it's bumping back into the 20 to 30% range. We don't really understand what the long-term use of all of these products will actually do to our lungs or other parts of the body. Definitely avoid the dank vapes of the world. This is one of the products that the New York Health Department identified as containing vitamin E acetate. Clearly avoid that, but I think going farther, it's still a touch complicated. And I think the hardest question here, like if you don't vape, it's really easy to say, don't start vaping. That's not the hard part. The hardest part is, what do you tell someone who's saying, should I vape instead of use tobacco? I think my approach at this point, and this is again me personally speaking, would be let's try combination NRT and or varenicline before we consider going down that line. If you're already vaping, then definitely try to use a trustworthy source and cut back. And like if someone asks me, I think until recently the answer was reasonable, that common sense dictates there's no tar, there's no toluene. It's probably going to cause less cancer and less problems for you in the long term if you vape instead of smoke. I don't know. That's it, right? Like we don't know for sure. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Good, sir.
When you say trustworthy source, like obviously patient you had that was like making it in bathtub or sink or whatever, it's not trustworthy. But are there actually any regulations on what's produced and sold?
So mango jewel pods, to a certain extent, there is technically, so like that's those same Health Canada acts we talked about, does give the government the power, the Food and Drug Act gives the government the power to go in and regulate, but it's more of a blacklist thing. It's not a whitelist thing, meaning that they can only say, I mean, I'm sure there's a regulation now that says you cannot put vitamin E acetate, but what about the next product that someone wants to try in? Maybe they just thought, you know, your lungs need to glow as much as your skin does with vitamin E, right? That's the challenge. Like, I think if you could do more of a whitelist situation, perhaps we'd be better off. But definitely, I think there's a lot of manufacturers that are doing their thing. Juul recently has stopped selling all their flavored stuff, and that's one of the policies that Trump's considering bringing in, though it's an election year, so who knows if the FDA decision will stand or not. But there's some movement. Hi.
I'm a parent of kids in their 20s, and you made this point earlier, but I just wondered if you could revisit it for me. So one vocabulary we say, the only people that are getting into trouble are the ones that are using the THC and related cartridges unregulated. Could you revisit and underline that point for me, please?
I think the answer to that is absolutely not. 15% is no small number. And again, this is 15% of those 2,500 people that have actually showed up to hospital, right? I hope this is not going on with your kids or anyone else's, but there's got to be thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands out there who are having some level of pneumonitis, we'll call it, in the lungs, not even barely noticing it. And we don't know what the long-term effects of that is. And we don't know like how far that can develop over time. But the simple answer is absolutely not. It's not just a THC related thing. Hi, Sandra.
Can you talk a little bit about how the acuteness of Valley is? Does it recover? Does it progress? Is there anything like ILD that happens? I know it's so early. What's the typical course?
So it's too early. The vast majority of folks do get better. I think the single biggest thing contributing to that is one, essentially stopping the vaping, right? It's one of those liver situations. And the second one being that if folks are getting really, really sick and they need the oxygen, they need the intubation to get through it, then they're getting through it. As far as I know, there's only been the one transplant. Yeah, it can be rapidly progressive in the sense that by the time a lot of people are showing up to hospital, they've had symptoms for a number of days and they look really, really poorly. The vast majority of folks tend to improve, and it's also partly a question of how poorly they've been doing. We don't have a lot of data on it. Like I can't tell you, oh, most people get better in a week or 2 weeks or 10 days. Like there are people in the States that are still hospitalized with this. Even though the peak, as we talked about, happened in that September timeframe. It's a touch early to tell from that end. Anyone else? Hey.
Is there any explanation why this is only seemed to be an issue in the last year or two versus the last 15 plus years that they've been available?
Yeah, I think part of it's the numbers game, right? So if you look, like it's 2015 to 2020, the number of people using vapes has, like it's accelerating. It has accelerated, right? So among young people, it's more than doubled, but amongst the regular population, it's gone up in much bigger numbers. I think because it's a significant market now, people are trying all kinds of different things. Previously, as that early data was showing, like the second gen and the devices don't deliver all that much nicotine, right? So people are not using it as much. There's got to be a few factors, but I think the biggest one being, for sure, I think you can say with like 90% confidence that a lot of the really sick acute cases we saw this summer were vitamin E acetate related. They were. That's why it got really bad in these last 6 months. But like you can see those numbers going back as far as 2017, like those numbers. If I can go back here, give me 1 second. So this data here, this is young people. This is 10 to 19-year-olds. This should not be increasing, right? Like fine, like this is the big spike. It's hard to not notice that one. This line here is 10 to 19-year-olds. Their levels of going to the hospital when they're having shortness of breath and smoking e-cigarettes are just going up and up. But we don't know what the long-term effects of this are going to be either. But for sure, that last 6 months, vitamin E acetate, 90% of the time, I'm sure 100% of the time.
And is that additive, is that found in universally across all of the liquids? Like is it in Juul as well as in that?
It's not supposed to be in Juul. It's not. Yeah. So it's not present in a lot of these products.
So I guess the next thing I'm wondering then is, of these people who end up in the hospital, is there any kind of, I don't know, are they looking back to find what was this particular person using? And is there any kind of pattern around that?
They are looking at what people are using. It's somewhat hard to judge. So as I've mentioned, like the majority of these people who've ended up with the severe E-Valley in hospital, they're actually like getting it from like secondhand types of sources, like either from a friend or like online dealer who will plug into the same into the same e-cigarette and stuff like that. It is really hard to track that because it's such an under-regulated market, right? Kind of like supplements and kind of like the new party we have going on with the edibles. We have no idea. Very, very unregulated. Thanks, guys.